If you've been granted DACA, what benefits does it provide? First and foremost, during the duration of having DACA, you will not be removed from the United States. Remember, it's only good for 2 years, so you will have to renew it, but we'll discuss that in a little bit. But for the duration of your DACA status, you will not have to live in fear of immigration officials knocking on your door, chasing you down, coming and grabbing you. If you are granted a work permit through DACA, then you can work. Now, if the state you live in does not otherwise exclude work permits issued via DACA as proof or requisite proof, then you could also obtain a state-issued ID or a driver's license. What does this mean? If you live in a state that requires certain types of document evidence to obtain a driver's license, usually one of those types of evidences to establish that you're here in the U.S. legally is either a green card or a work permit. Now, there is a category that's listed on your actual work permit that establishes how did you obtain your work permit. If you recall earlier when we were discussing the forms for DACA, I had discussed that the code for a DACA requester on their work permit is code C33. So that code will actually be on your work permit. So when you receive your work permit and you go to your local DMV and you present it as proof that you're here legally and say, hey, this is the reason why I want to get my driver's license, each state has its own requirements as to what they will recognize as requisite proof to be able to get a driver's license in that state. So if you are living in a state that does not recognize a DACA approved or a DACA categorized work permit, you may not be able to get a driver's license or a state issued ID in your state. So it behooves you to actually check and see, what does the state that I'm living in require? Do they recognize a DACA approved work permit? If you're not sure, jump online and check, or place a call to your local MVA and say, if I have an approved DACA, category C33 on my work permit, am I eligible for a driver's license or a state-issued ID? Another benefit that having a DACA approval will grant you is, again, depending on where you live, in-state tuition. It may not be available in the jurisdiction that you live in, but if you are in a jurisdiction that actually says yes, if you are a DACA-approved individual and you can otherwise prove that you are a resident of our state, we will grant you in-state tuition, then good for you. But again, check with your state and or check with the institution, the educational institution that you plan on enrolling in, to see if that's even a benefit that you can gain if you're a DACA recipient. Next is travel outside of the U.S. Now, this is a little gray zone, and it's advised that if you are planning to travel, you need to sit down and speak to accredited immigration attorney to figure out if this is even an option that you should exercise. Now, DHS has let us know that you may be able to travel if you first obtain what's called advanced parole, and only after you've obtained an approval, a DACA approval, and only after you have established that the reason for you needing to travel outside of the U.S. is humanitarian. Say, for instance, somebody is sick or somebody needs attending to that's on their deathbed. That would be considered a humanitarian matter that would require you to leave the U.S. Or if you are currently employed and your job is sending you outside of the U.S., or for educational reasons, say, for instance, a semester abroad. That sounds benign enough, except for the fact that there are other immigration laws that could render you ineligible to come back into the U.S. And you would not know if those immigration laws even apply to you unless you actually sat down with an immigration attorney. In other words, you could go through the whole process of establishing that, providing proof that you're DACA approved, actually getting advanced parole from USCIS after you established what the reason was for your travels, and then you travel. And then upon your attempt to re-enter the U.S., at the point of entry, the Customs and Border Patrol officer tells you for other immigration regulation violations, you cannot re-enter into the U.S. So for this reason, it's advised, not unless you absolutely have to, don't even explore this option. Stay put, because as we've stressed earlier, DACA is not a law. So in other words, you don't have any regulated or statutorial rights to be in the U.S. So that upon your point of re-entry, if there are other violations that would render you otherwise inadmissible, even with an advanced parole, you could find yourself locked out. So again, if you're not too sure about whether or not this is an option that you should even explore, it's strongly advised that you sit down with a reputable and accredited attorney to sort out should you even apply for advanced parole, or if you've gone through the extra steps of applying for it, should you even actually use it. Next section is what happens to your DACA approval after the 2 years is up. As stated above, deferred action is only granted for a period of 2 years, after which you actually have to reapply for DACA and reapply for your work authorization. Please note, your work authorization will only be as good for as long as your DACA is granted you. So in other words, you don't get a work permit that lasts forever. Your work permit will have very explicitly stated on it the expiration date for it, which means that more than likely any other benefits that you obtained by showing your work permit, say for instance a state-issued ID or a driver's license, will also have an expiration date that is consistent with the expiration date of your work permit.